Hi, my name is David Adam, and I'm doing my older adult oral video presentation. And obviously, the links aren't in the PowerPoint yet because I'm recording it right now. So, my subject is a 68-year-old white woman um, who grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in the 50s and 60s, and let's get into it. So, the developmental stages I looked for with Erickson was actually stages 4 and 5. So, four, industry versus inferiority, and five, identity versus identity confusion. And the reason why I focused on two stages is based on my subject's self reports. I really saw a huge interplay in creating an academic self concept in industry versus inferiority, and learning a sense of industry in themselves and how that influenced their identity development moving forward. And I have some references to my annotated bibliography here where Earp talks about the academic self concept in elementary school, and getting an ingrained sense of inferiority or industry, which will affect identity going forward in life. And there's also a fair amount of research about previous developmental stages. Erickson spoke about it himself, being needed to be resolved in order to have success in the next developmental stages. And then also there's additional research in the role of friendships in identity formation. Um, so I saw a lot of that in my subject self reports. Um, Important experiences that my subject had in their psychosocial development were elementary school. They had a teacher named Mrs. Bernhardt, and they were in advanced classes. And Mrs. Bernhardt was the hardest teacher they ever had. And they ended up meeting friends from elementary school much later in life who were really serious academics in their career. And they all agreed that Mrs. Bernhardt was the most difficult teacher they ever had. And they never had to work harder academically than they did with Mrs. Bernhardt. So my subject had a lot of respect for Mrs. Bernhardt, and also a lot of contempt for Mrs. Bernhardt. And this is really intertwined with industry versus inferiority, in that when we enter into the elementary school age, we start to interact with significant others outside of the home. We start to know ourselves in relationships other than family. And this is where, especially in school, we can get a sense of, am I capable of navigating this environment and being successful, or am I not capable of it? So my subject got, what I saw was a real continuum of industry versus inferiority, where ultimately they learned that they were capable, but they did have a lot of challenge, of feeling very challenged by this intense academic environment, where they spoke about how, and this is like, fifth grade, right? Where my subject didn't even know that there was a school nurse, because you wouldn't ask to go to the nurse in this class. That's how serious the students were. And you can also see systems theory in this, in that this was New York City public school in Brooklyn, at the very beginning of the baby boom. This was before the baby boom generation resulted in overcrowding and problems with classroom size, which actually then had an effect in my subject's continued development, which we'll get into. So part of that macro issue of overcrowding was they started to skip kids forward in grades. So my subject was actually learning algebra, and in getting into middle and high school when they were not even 11 yet. So Piaget comes in here with the theory of cognitive development, that this person had to use abstract thinking, right? Um, Formal operations, when they were not able to do it. right? They were still in concrete operations. They couldn't do that abstract thought, the idea of let X equal 3. They couldn't do that, right? Um, so that's cognitive development being affected by systems theory, by macro issues, right? And also this goes into that industry versus inferiority in Erikson's psychosocial development, but it also plays into um, forming an identity. Because this was a reinforcing experience um, that was negative for them, where they were being asked to do something that they were not old enough to do yet. So when they started to have interactions with peers who were older, um, they would resist. They would resist that. I don't want to talk about Vietnam. I don't want to talk about the draft. I don't want to talk about upsetting geopolitical issues. I want to read Nancy Drew. I want to bake cookies. I want to sing songs. I want to do things that are age appropriate for an 11 or a 12-year-old. So we start to see this personality come out, which is I am going to be direct. I am going to stand up for myself. I am going to be tenacious, right? And would they have been able to do that if they didn't have this sense of industry, from the academic success prior? So we saw that happening with a friend named Cheryl, right? Cheryl was an older friend who did want to talk about Vietnam and stuff like that. So that's so to bring in systems theory again, right? That's a transaction they're having with the environment, right? Um, that's taking away energy from them, right? Um, uh, they don't like it, right? So they ended that friendship, right? And then that was reinforced by ultimately finding other friends that were more age appropriate. Moving was also a big part of development, especially in identity formation. They moved in high school when they were still much younger than all the other kids. They continued to be younger than all the other kids in their grades moving forward because of skipping classes. And then extracurricular resources were huge in developmental psychosocial development, and we'll look more into that as we move through the slides. Challenges and accomplishments, right? So challenged academically by Mrs. Bernhardt in elementary school. We spoke about that. I mentioned the continuum of industry versus inferiority, where they always felt they had to compete with these other students that they thought were slightly better than them. Those other students would have averages of 90, 95. My subject would have averages of like 87. We spoke about how that's an antecedent to identity formation. Spoke about friendships and holding on to age-appropriate behaviors. So we'll get into moving soon. School overcrowding. The algebra with the formal operations. Needed to fight to hold on to childhood. And that personality I spoke about, being strong, opinionated, direct, tenacious. Reinforced by deselecting friendship with Pierre Cheryl over Vietnam identity. So one of the studies I looked at in my annotated bibliography was about friendship selection, deselection, and influence, right? And these researchers Workham et al. They what they found was that adolescents would not select friends based on if they had the same level of happiness. They would select friends over do we have shared interests? Do we do similar behaviors, right? But they would stay in friendships if they had the same level of happiness, right? So adolescents would leave friendships if my friends aren't as happy as me. I feel like they're downers. Or my friends are happier than me and I'm jealous, right? And they also found that mood would be influenced by peers, right? So you hang out with friends that are happy, your mood tends to lift, and vice versa. So the subject in this situation, the story goes that them and their friend Cheryl were 10, 11. still living in Brooklyn, going to dance classes, ballet, having sleepovers, reading Nancy Drew novels. And then Cheryl, who was a year or two older, had two brothers who were of draft age. And they didn't get drafted, but there was fear that they would get drafted to Vietnam. So Cheryl tells the subject, my subject, I've been working on this picture all week. I want you to come over to my house this weekend to see it. And the subject, and I'm saying the subject, and I'm being very vague about it because my subject was a little cagey about fully revealing their identity. So I'm just trying to be sensitive to that. So the subject went over to Cheryl's house, and Cheryl shows the subject this picture, which is this 6 foot long, 12-inch tall canvas that Cheryl stretched herself of a soldier in a coffin. And my subject realizes that this is all about fear of Cheryl's older brothers getting drafted and, the war in Vietnam. And my subject doesn't want to think about those things. My subject is 11 years old and wants to continue to do age appropriate things for an 11-year-old, right? So they stop being friends. So that's friendship deselection, right? Chose to end the friendship because of dissimilar levels of happiness, which is what researchers Workham et al. Also noticed in their study. And then later, my subject made friends with somebody who was closer to their own age, who had similar interests in just doing well academically and doing things that were more traditional for, a young preteen girl. So that was reinforced by the environment that this was a good choice. This was a good choice. This type of identity of being kind of tenacious, maybe even sometimes stubborn, is working for you, right? And then later, when my subject moved to a new school district, there was a lot of competition between them and other girls that they were unaware of. So they weren't popular and they were ostracized. But because of already having this solid identity, it really didn't get under their skin that much. But they did start experimenting with different social groups, some of whom were very into drugs. Now, my subject was interested in drugs because they thought drugs were going to be fun. But when they started hanging out with Sarah, the peer who was getting pretty entrenched in some pretty heavy drug use, my subject soon found out that drug use also entailed a lot of potential violence and dysfunctional situations and boredom and misery and monotony. And because of already having this strong sense of self in industry and developing this identity of being able to be resistant, being able to stand up, being able to be stubborn, they were able to deselect those friendships, which also had dissimilar levels of happiness. So once again, this identity is being reinforced by the environment, right? By transactions with the environment. And a lot of this identity was established in early elementary, right? In that phase of industry versus inferiority. And in some of these research articles I did for my annotated bibliography, they do quote Erikson, and Erikson saying that all these different psychosocial issues are present in all stages, just some issues are more central in certain stages. So continuing on. Okay, so we spoke about this slide. Next slide. Spoke about moving, conflicts and competition. So to speak a little bit more about that, I'm about to lose the 15 minutes, so I'm going to pause it and go into another recording. See y'all in a second.